Very good morning to everyone, whether you're on the West Coast or East Coast of Canada or somewhere else. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you for joining our web event today, where we will be speaking with Professor Reza Hazmath. I will share a short version of Reza's bio in a moment. Suffice to say, right off the top, Reza is a close partner of the China Institutes and the lead author for How China Sees the World 2025. He'll be today unveiling and walking us through the results of this year's survey in the next hour or so. My name is Philip Rowe. I'm the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. Before we jump into things, allow me to do a little bit of housekeeping and make a couple of preliminary comments. The first thing I'll say is our presentation by Reza should last approximately about 40 minutes. And we do want to leave at least 20 to 25 minutes for questions and answers at the end. So please, as you listen to Reza unveil the results of the survey, take some notes and prepare some questions, which you can type into the box, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as possible. Please also note that this event is being recorded, and so we'll be making it available on our website in the coming few days. I'd also like to note that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, respects histories, languages, cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. I'd also like to share a quick word with our viewers about the China Institute itself. We try to position ourselves at the confluence of scholarship and policy work. And we are the largest institute dedicated to the study of China in Canada. We're independent thanks to a significant and visionary endowment that was offered some 20 years ago from Edmonton's McTaggart family and from the Alberta government. We seek to do many things, but our areas of focus are to help deepen understanding of China writ large. We also try to chart some paths forward for informed and productive engagement with China. And we also really try to take a close look at global issues where more productive engagement with China is accretive to the global commons. And we're trying to focus on areas that are not only relevant to the world, but also relevant to Alberta and to Canada, such as climate, health, energy, food, and the like. We also support the University of Alberta academic community through a substantial grants program, and we also offer training to government and civil society through a variety of educational events and courses. Okay, so that's about our institute. We're now back to the survey. I'm personally very excited to have a chance to talk to Reza about the survey because this is the third one, and so it creates a nice baseline over time to identify some trends. This year has also been, as we all know, a year of tumult and change on the world scene. Obviously precipitated by the upheavals in world order as a function of Trump 2.0. And we've also, over the last few months, been witnessing a shift in perception towards China, both in Canada and abroad, with a slight uptick in terms of the willingness to take a look at China. And also, obviously, this is not just happening in Canada, but it's happening all around the world. In fact, in some parts of the world now, China garners equal or indeed sometimes greater favorability ratings than the United States. That's kind of a step change that's going to inform a lot of policymakers' triangulations going forward. And from that perspective, the results of being able to have a granularity, a sense of the way Chinese perceive the world is going to be very, very useful. So that's what makes this survey really special. It's an opportunity to garner insights into Chinese citizens' perceptions of international affairs and the role that China should be playing therein. As many of you will know, it's not an exercise that's always easy to undertake in China. And so the breadth and depth of information that flows from this exercise means that, to my mind, the survey will be of interest not only to scholars and researchers, but also to policymakers and interested members of the general public, helping all of us understand and inform our understanding of contemporary Chinese society, as well as some of the internal drivers of China's future foreign policy direction. So I'm very excited by this opportunity. It's really thanks to the leadership of Professor Hazmat that we have the chance to be talking about this today. As many of you will appreciate, it's not always easy to do survey work in the PRC. There's challenges with respect to possible preference falsification and data collection that are always present. But these results, I think, still hold a lot of validity and will be of great interest. Moreover, with this third iteration, we can see trend lines emerging that will indicate broader tendencies and allow us to some extent to transcend any of those methodological limitations. Indeed, the trend lines we're starting to see will be especially pertinent at this current time of emerging great power rivalry and increased agency and room to maneuver for middle powers. So Reza, as we walk through this, perhaps you can share some of your observations that flow from this enhanced ability to identify trends over time. Before I turn to you, I would like to share with the watchers, with the viewership, just a very short bio of yours. So Reza, you're a full professor at the University of Alberta. You're an academic faculty advisor to the China Institute, and you've previously held faculty positions in management, sociology, and political science at the U of T, at the University of Melbourne, and also Oxford. Reza has worked for and advised global think tanks, consultancies, development agencies, and social organizations, and has some award-winning research that examines how the behavior of emerging Chinese state and non-state actors potentially affects salient theories, practices, and assumptions in international affairs. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Civil Society. Right. But I'll stop there. I could go on, but I'll stop there. So Reza, perhaps I'm in your hands. The survey is neatly divided into several themes. I'm not sure what approach you'd prefer. Do you want to highlight key findings, walk us through the various chapters in the survey? Or perhaps maybe just start by sharing a few thoughts as to why ab initio you decided to embark in this project a few years ago and why you viewed it as significant. So over to you, and thank you again for the work.
Well, thank you, Philippe, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for participating in this webinar. If it's not up for, I mean, if it wasn't for Philippe's team, this project would not be happening. So I'm thankful that Philippe's and China Institute has participated in this sort of survey over the last 3 years, and will continue to do so in the coming years. I mean, I guess I should say what the overlying sort of motivation to do a survey such as this is to have evidence to understand A, how the Chinese public thinks, and B, how can us in the West actually try to engage China in a much more fruitful fashion. I just felt that we were engaging with China through more ideological sort of premises rather than evidence-based kind of policymaking. And I think this is just a small way to gain some insights into what the Chinese public thinks and to understand what sort of leeway we have to actually engage the public. But even more so, as I'm going to jump into the formal presentation, what's really interesting about understanding what the public thinks is that the party also is crucially aware of what the public thinks, and they actually monitor what the public thinks. It gives them a sort of a legitimacy in many respects to what their policies are at present and what they can potentially do now and into the future. So I think for the whole variety of reasons, this is why I really wanted for us to actually engage in these kinds of surveys. I'm sure many of you have questions on methodology. I'll get into that during Q&As. I'm happy to answer them as well. So perhaps I can just share my screen with you and we can jump into the sort of formal presentation. So let me start here. As you can see, there is a website that you can see a lot of the data that's going to be presented today. It's howchinaseestheworld.com. And the data actually shows the last 3 years worth of information that we've gathered. There's a lot of refined data that's not on the website, but you get a general overview about some of the major questions we ask in the survey. With an audience such as this, I don't need to reiterate how geopolitical and diplomatic relations between China and Canada, China, many Western jurisdictions, really have had heightened tensions and challenges throughout the 2020s. Part of it is China's ascendancy as a global power is challenging how we go about international relations. It might be in conflict in the way we go about certain things globally. But ultimately, China's ascendancy as a global power is shaping the sort of political, economic, and security international frameworks. So it's really imperative for us to understand what sort of perceptions Chinese citizens have towards foreign states and internationally salient issues. And again, I can't stress this enough. This is super important because it gives us an understanding, A, of how the party thinks, because it tells us what sort of leeway the party has in order to engage with particular foreign policy initiatives. Perhaps I can say a few words about the survey. As Philippe mentioned, this is the third iteration of the survey. We've ran it since 2023 and done so on an annual basis. What's interesting about this survey is that it's much more demographically representative than quick surveys that's often done on these topics. And what I mean by that is it takes about 2 to 3 months to gather all the data. And we usually go through the rural areas of China. We use telephone surveys to go through some of the hidden populations in academic speak. So it's a really representative and statistically valid, candid account of how the general Chinese public views other jurisdictions and their relationships with China. Um, in particular, the questions are asking citizens in China their perceptions about Australia, Canada, EU, France, Germany, India, Japan, Russia, UK, and the United States. There's so many other jurisdictions we would like to look at, but at the end of the day, there might be survey fatigue. In fact, as you can see, there are 33 questions that's asked of respondents. So it is a relatively long survey. And they generally involve 7-point Likert scale questions. So it goes from 1 to 7, 4 being neutral. And you'll see when I give you the responses what sort of figures that we get there. But as you can see from the map as well, there's a sort of a good geographical representation of the survey. Okay, so let's get into the findings. And the first set of findings I want to talk about is, how do Chinese citizens view the world? What is their global perception? And one of the first questions that's asked is, well, who has the most global influence in the world? Well, surprise, surprise, Chinese citizens strongly indicated that China is the world's most powerful nation. If I can see your faces, I'm sure it'd be like, well, people are not surprised by that. And in fact, in 2025, we see 72% of respondents saw China as the most powerful nation. This is up since 2024 by 5%. Well, this is where it becomes interesting. The second most influential jurisdiction was the United States, and that's been consistent across all three waves. Then it's followed by Russia. Now, in the first year, we thought, well, how could Russia be seen as the most influential? There has to be a blip here. Then we start seeing Russia as seen as an influential nation in Chinese public's eyes in last year's iteration. And again, in this year's iteration, we see Russia playing a prominent role. Um, Russia is going to play a prominent role in these results, and I'll speak a bit more about why that might be the case. So first we have China, second we have the United States, third Russia, then the European Union. For our Canadian audience and our Australian audience, those are two jurisdictions where they're seen as having the lowest global influence. In fact, Australia is seen to have the lowest global influence. Interestingly enough, when I spoke to my Australian counterparts just a few days ago about this, they were not surprised by it. They weren't shocked, or shall I say. And so it's interesting that China, US, Russia, Canada, India, Australia are seen as the lowest there. Now, the next sort of slide I want to talk about is trust. And the reason why we're fascinated by trust is that you need minimum levels of trust in both sides to actually engage with each other. Put differently, if two states are coming together, they need to trust each other at a minimum level to engage with each other. So we ask the question, well, which global partners do you trust the most? Um, Russia. Russia is seen as the most trusted global partner. And this is a status that's held since 2023. Japan, the United States have the lowest levels of trustworthiness. This has been a consistent reality since 2023 as well. Now, Japan, for historical reasons, is not seen as a trustworthy partner to China among citizens' eyes. The United States is seen as an arch rival. So there are very simple explanations why we see that sort of reality. In fact, if we dig deeper into the United States perception, we see party members High income earners and highly educated respondents were more likely to express higher trust in the United States, which suggests that if you dig a bit deeper, there are some demographic, socioeconomic lines, divisions, which we can disaggregate in terms of who trusts the United States and who does not trust the United States. I'll say a few words about Canada when I get to Canada, about how Chinese citizens perceive Canada. But as you can tell from as preview, it's not in a very trustworthy sort of manner relative to Russia or Germany or France. Let's continue on. Um, One of the questions we ask is, well, who has the most long-term importance to China? I promised you that Russia is going to be playing a dominant role in these responses, and here again, Russia is playing that role. Russia is viewed as the most important jurisdiction to China's long-term future, albeit this is down by 3% year over year. So last year, it was 3% lower. There's a perception that Canada and Australia are relatively insignificant to China's long-term future. And in fact, we see this as a perception that's remained consistent over the last 3 years. And you can see that in the chart immediately to the left-hand side, where in 2023, 42%, 2024, 44%, and 2025, 42% have seen, really at the bottom where Canada is perceived as a long-term important partner to China. So that does not dwell very well from one standpoint. Again, I'll explain more about the Canadian sort of reality in a few slides, but this sort of sets up the sort of position that Canada has amongst the Chinese public. Okay, so who is the most likely actor to engage in a military conflict in the next decade? Well, the United States is perceived as the most probable military opponent, with 62% of respondents assigning high likelihood scores. This has been consistent over the last 3 years as well. And in fact, it's to the point where the United States is seen as perhaps the only major actor that China is in direct conflict with, and a conflict that might be in military terms. Um, France, Germany, Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom are collectively regarded as unlikely to engage in military conflict with China. And these are very low scores, likelihood scores assigned to them. Russia, as well, is not viewed as an adversary. 42 respondents assigning it the lowest score of 1. What's really interesting about the United States, and it plays out in terms of how China might see a resolution to Taiwan. If for the most part, and there's a slide on, well, I'll talk more about this, where for the most part, um, Chinese citizens believe that there can be a diplomatic solution with Taiwan. However, the caveat is this: if the United States is involved, they believe that a military solution is the most likely outcome. So that kind of paints a sort of picture we have in terms of how the United States is perceived as a potential military conflict adversary within the next decade. So let's turn our attention to how citizens perceive their global roles. What should China's global roles be? What support do citizens have for China's global roles? Um, so one of the questions we directly ask is, which issue area should China take an active global leadership role? Peacekeeping remains the top choice, with 70% assigning it as the highest level of importance. And this is rising steadily over the last 3 years. In fact, in 2023, we saw 62% of participants believe that peacekeeping, that China should play a more active role in peacekeeping. It's now 70%. Now, this is interesting because if you sort of draw, connect the dots, China's military expenditure is increasing. In the current 5-year plan and in the next 5-year plan, the assumption is we're going to see an increase in military spending. And so, in many respects, we're seeing that there's an alignment between what China is doing and what citizens want China to do. Citizens want China to play a role, an active role in conflict zones around the world, whether it's Israel, Palestine, whether it's Russia, Ukraine. Um, Chinese citizens want China to play an active role when it comes to peacekeeping. And in many respects, the decline of Western-led peacekeeping initiatives has provided an opportunity for China to actually engage in greater peacekeeping missions and ultimately to reshape global security frameworks. The way China peacekeeps might be slightly different. In fact, that's putting it lightly. The way China actually peacekeeps is different than the way Western jurisdictions might peacekeep. And so there are some implications to this sort of aspiration to engage in greater peacekeeping. Um, Second on the list is technological leadership. So citizens want China to take a more active global leadership role in technology. And again, this has been quite consistent over the last 3 years. Insofar, it's been the second most important choice among citizens for what role China should play in terms of global leadership. And in fact, we see that technological leadership has risen since 2024 and 2025, almost 9%. Um, so again, the top line sort of argument here is this. Citizens want peacekeeping. They want there's room for China to increase peacekeeping activities, play a role in major global conflict zones, and second, to play a greater role in technological sort of leadership around the world. Um, Now, we have sort of these sort of conversations within our own jurisdictions about should we decouple from China? Should we de-risk from China? In fact, rather than being pro or anti-decoupling, the Chinese public generally express a preference for expanding cooperation and expanding technological and research collaboration. And this has been quite consistent over the last 3 years. So we're starting to see some trend lines really developing. Um, Chinese citizens want greater cooperation with all jurisdictions that was examined. But Russia is perceived as the most strategically significant partner. And part of it could be pragmatic. As Western jurisdictions removed itself from Russia, it created a vacuum for Chinese businesses and activities to engage with Russia. So, in many respects, it's not quite surprising to see Russia is seen as a strategically significant partner. Um, in terms of attitudes towards China's global engagement, so the survey asked respondents to rate their agreeableness between one, strongly agree, and seven, strongly agree. I apologize. It asked citizens to rate their agreeableness between one, strongly disagree, and seven, strongly agree, with a series of seven statements on Chinese foreign affairs and global relationships. And ultimately, one of the questions that was asked was, should China concentrate more on domestic affairs than on global matters? In fact, citizens generally want China to be a bit more internal looking overall. They do not want China to export its model overseas in an overt fashion. So one of the questions was asked, China's political and economic model should be exported to other nations. There really is an appetite for China to do so. Where there is an appetite is when we ask the question, should China increase its global military presence in order to improve China's national security? And there's an overwhelming response that citizens have that support for China to do so. So not only do citizens want China to increase its sort of scope in peacekeeping, it wants China to increase its global military presence in order to improve China's national security. So it's kind of interesting to see this sort of collaboration in terms of China's outward looking sort of approach from a security lens, more peacekeeping and greater military presence to improve China's national security. Um, Let me turn my attention now to tourism, study, work, and immigration. Um, I'll give you four very basic pie charts here, but they're quite indicative of what we've seen over the last 3 years. First and foremost, let's turn our attention to tourism. Um, in terms of where citizens want to visit in the next decade, France is number one, Japan number two, Russia number three, then we have the UK, US, Australia, and Canada. So amongst Western jurisdictions, Canada is performing on average or slightly below average of what citizens want in terms of tourism. In terms of studying, this is where it becomes super fascinating. In the last two iterations, the United States was not the number one destination. In fact, it was the United Kingdom, Australia placed very high, Europe, particularly Germany and France, placed very high. But in this iteration, we see the United States has placed as a destination of choice as place number one. Now, this is a bit perplexing because given the new administration in the United States, giving crackdowns on students and visa restrictions, we would not expect to see this sort of reality. But I have to reiterate, what we're asking citizens is, where do they want to study if in a perfect sort of scenario? And it seems that the United States is the destination of choice. So, and another way to think about this is when we look at perceptions of how citizens view the world, there's often a lag. So, how they see the world, how when we survey them now, it's usually a preference formation that's constructed, say, a year or two ago. So we're looking back in history in many respects to see how their preferences are, and it's not necessarily swayed by, everyday news going on right now. So in many respects, we would expect to see that shift potentially in the United States attractiveness if we do the survey next year and the year afterwards. My assumption is we're going to see a decline in terms of the attractiveness of the United States. So again, it could potentially be explained by that lag in terms of perception to reality. Um, in terms of working and immigration, we see the United States as a choice of destination for working. For a Canadian audience, Canada is seen as the top destination of choice for immigration. Over the last few years, particularly in the 2020s, we've had some generous immigration policies, and it seems as though, and again, if you think of chain migration going on from China to Canada, there's a long history there. So it's not surprising to see that Canada is one of the top destinations of choice for immigration. Um, okay, so let's dig a bit deeper into Canada and China relations here. Um, Now, I've mentioned that trust in Canada is declining. So let's dig deeper into what I mean by that. So we see in 2023, one of the questions we ask is, which partners do you trust to engage with? And as I mentioned beforehand, you need to have minimum levels of trust to actually engage with another actor. So China and Canada must have minimum levels of trust to engage with each other. Otherwise, it's generally not a fruitful partnership. And so it's a bit concerning, shall we say, that trust in Canada as a partner is declining from 2023 onwards. So in 23, we saw 33%, last year 33%, this year is 29%. So who generally trusts Canada? If we break down the data, it's usually individuals who have higher family incomes, those who are more educated, those who are living in large urban areas. Generally, females trust Canada more than males, and those with children tend to trust Canada more than those without children. Who does not trust Canada? Generally, those who are divorced, and generally those who are students or unemployed. So that gives you a sort of a insight into the sort of characteristics of which individuals trust and does not trust Canada. And again, why this is useful is that it allows us to have more targeted public diplomacy to improve our imaging in China. If Canada does want to improve our imaging in China, we would want to target certain demographics where we're underperforming, so to speak. Um, in terms of economic cooperation, there is extremely strong support for expanding economic collaboration with Canada. In fact, three-quarters of respondents favored strengthening bilateral trade and investment ties in 2025. And this is consistent with figures from last year, and it's much higher than the 66% recorded in 2023. We saw that support for enhanced economic cooperation remains concentrated among highly educated citizens, urban residents, and party members. So if you want to break that down a bit more, this is the sort of demographics that are in favor of economic cooperation or greater economic cooperation with Canada, rather. If we look at other types of cooperation, particularly environmental or cultural exchanges, again, we start to see a trend here. We see higher income, higher educated respondents are consistently exhibiting above average enthusiasm for environmental cooperation. This is potentially due to heightened awareness about the ecological challenges and the sort of benefits that coordinated action, climate action between Canada and China might produce. We also see cultural diplomacy remains a robust avenue for engagement between Canada and China, with 76% of respondents expressing a positive sentiment towards expanding cultural exchanges. So, I mean, overall, we see that there is a heightened sense of wanting to engage with Canada for environmental cooperation and cultural exchanges. When we look at global governance and security cooperation, it is steady, with 71% of respondents favoring a closer collaboration, and it reflects continuity from 2024 and 2023. So there's a sort of a steady 7 out of 10 citizens want cooperation in terms of global governance with Canada. In terms of security collaboration, 76% of respondents endorse expanding security collaboration with Canada. And this is a significant increase from 2023, where it was 70%. Again, the high levels of cooperation is concentrated on higher income and highly educated demographics, as well as party members and urban residents. So you're really starting to see a skew towards who actually supports Canada, who trusts Canada, who wants to engage with Canada, who wants to cooperate with Canada. They're generally from the higher incomes, higher educated, urbanites, and party members as well. And conversely, it tells us what sort of demographics we need to do a better job in trying to target in terms of our public diplomacy, to improve our image in China, as well as to ultimately try to engineer greater support for cooperation with Canada. Now, there's a recurring theme about what influences Canada-China relations. There's a general perception, in fact, there's an overwhelming perception among Chinese citizens that the Canadian public lacks a strong understanding of China. And so, in many respects, this can partially explain the lack of trust with Canada, the fact that the Canadian public does not really understand China. And this trend has been persistent across all waves of this survey. And in fact, in 2025, 54% of respondents indicated that Canadians had a poor grasp of the nation. When we asked citizens, well, what's the most significant factor influencing Canada-China relations? Most responded that it's because of China's expanding global influence. And that plays a major impact in terms of how Canada and China are relating to each other. Closely behind is Canada's alignment with the United States. So 8 out of 10 respondents basically said that our close alignment with the United States is affecting Canada-China relations. And again, this should not be surprising to the room, but it just reinforces this idea that for the average Chinese citizen, we are seen as a pole of the United States. Dare I say, not the 51st state, but very close in terms of our alignment with the United States. And that dramatically influences Canada-China relations. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to sources of knowledge of global jurisdictions. In other words, where do Chinese citizens learn about the world? How do they get the information, and how do they absorb this information in terms of their perceptions? So historically, there's always been a relationship between knowledge and trust. So the underlying idea is this: the more knowledge you have of a nation, the more likely you are to trust the nation. So generally, that maxim holds true for most jurisdictions. And it holds generally true for our case as well. Citizens generally, those who reported greater knowledge of a particular jurisdiction, more likely they are to trust that jurisdiction. So the more they knew about Canada, ironically, the more likely they are to trust Canada. Now, this maxim holds true except for 2 cases for this survey, for Japan and the United States. So you can see the sort of correlations there. And in both charts, you can see in the chart on the left, you can see the raw scores. Ultimately, familiarity generally correlates with trust, except for Japan and the United States. And perhaps for Japan, as I kind of hinted beforehand, for historical factors, there are some divergences there. And the United States, it's seen as such a rival that even though the average citizen has knowledge of the United States, they may not trust the United States. So those are the 2 outliers, but for the most part, greater familiarity engineers greater trust of the jurisdiction. So where do citizens learn about the world? Where do they learn about global affairs? And again, this should not be surprising that the overwhelming number of respondents suggested that they use social media to obtain information about the global affairs. This is true across age categories, education categories, residential location, employment status. Again, not surprising, 18 to 29-year-olds, what I call the she generation, they're the ones who are engaged with social media the most and are learning about global affairs through social media. Now, that should not be surprising in itself, because that's a trend line we see in most jurisdictions around the world. Why it has particular importance in the Chinese context is for these reasons. Generally speaking, traditional media is easier to control if you're the party. In other words, it's easier to have messaging, the party's messaging infusing into the general public through traditional media. Generally speaking, if you're working in television, radio, or newspapers, you often will get guidelines from the party about what are some areas to stress, what are some areas not to stress, what areas not to even talk about, perhaps, or what areas you want to heighten. So there's a direct link between party messaging and traditional media. Um, for social media, it's not that direct. In other words, it's much more difficult for the party to pass on its messaging in a direct fashion to the general public through social media. Put differently, it tells us that if you're a foreign actor or if you're a non-party actor, you can actually influence how the general public thinks if you are able to get onto social media and to have messaging through social media that might reinforce certain parameters, a certain sort of messaging, shall we say. So we do see that the younger cohorts, the She generation, and in general, the general population is much more susceptible to outside thinking through social media and to learning about the world through social media. And that's a dramatic shift from years ago where traditional media was the dominant actor in terms of where individuals got information about global affairs. Okay, so let's see a few other sort of words about some of the notable findings throughout the survey. First and foremost, we have to explain the Russia effect. This has been a constant theme in the last three iterations of the survey, where Russia plays a prominent role in many of the responses. It got to the point where in the first year we were like, is there a analytical flaw here? Is there a surveying flaw here? In the second year, we started seeing trend lines developing where we're thinking, well, there has to be some deeper reasons why Russia plays a role. And I kind of mentioned the pragmatic reason, whereby there's a market that's available to the Chinese, and Western jurisdictions are removing itself from Russia, whereby China can enter that market. And in this iteration, we digged a bit deeper into who is actually supporting Russia in many respects. And so we see media-driven narratives rather than political ideology or personal discourse that largely shapes citizens' trust in Russia. We see television playing a dominant role in shaping knowledge, reinforcing pro-Russian narratives, while personal discussions introduce skepticism. So put differently, when we see citizens talking to each other about Russia, we see that they develop greater skepticism towards Russia. But if they're listening purely to television or traditional media for the most part, we see this is playing a greater role in shaping knowledge about Russia. We see higher education has a mild positive effect, but our trust again appears to be more shaped by media exposure rather than formal schooling. We also see age, gender, income, and party membership shows no significant effect on why individuals are pro or anti-Russia. So that does not necessarily play a role. Ultimately, it does seem that there's a media-driven narrative about why we see Russia has such an affinity towards the Chinese public. Um, I mentioned beforehand that when we look at Sino-Taiwan reunification, citizens generally want a diplomatic reunification with Taiwan, but if the United States is involved, it would be less supportive. In fact, they'd be more likely to be supportive of a military solution. We saw response interest in pursuing a diplomatic solution with Taiwan depending on educational levels and their monthly household income. And so we can see the sort of charts that reinforce what I just said there at the bottom. Um, in terms of China's role in global conflict hotspots, as I kind of mentioned in many different ways, the Chinese public wants China to play a more active role in resolving conflicts around the world. We see females and those residing in rural areas were more or less likely to support any potential Chinese involvement in resolving conflicts. In other words, we're seeing more males and we're seeing more urbanites more wanting China to play a greater role in resolving conflicts around the world, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Palestine. And again, these trends do have notable implications if it comes to peacekeeping, if it comes into whether or not they would have alternative approaches towards these conflicts that might counter Western-led approaches. There's some significant implications if China does increase its presence in global conflict hotspots. And again, the citizens, generally speaking, want China to do so. Um, One of the questions that we've asked over the last three waves, and this is a question that I think is super important because let me give you context to this. If the Canadian government or the Australian government or any government does X internationally, I often have to believe that it doesn't necessarily mean it reflects the popular will of the society at large. It might reflect 40%, 50%, even 20%, but it does not overwhelmingly reflect the will and attitudes of its people. So one of the questions that we ask is, well, does a foreign government's actions reflect the will and attitudes of its people? Chinese citizens overwhelmingly believe that a foreign government's actions accurately reflect domestic popular opinion. So if Canada does an action towards China, the idea among Chinese citizens, the average Chinese citizen, is that, well, this action that the Canadian government does reflects what the domestic population of Canada wants to occur. And this has been quite consistent over the last three waves, this sort of reality that a foreign government's actions accurately reflect the will and attitudes of its people. So, in closing, what can I say? Well, in this third iteration, it really highlights a very strong public support for China's global leadership, particularly in the security sort of element, as well as for technological elements as well. As I, sort of as we've seen throughout this conversation we're having, China's growing military strength is framed as a necessary component of national security, and China's military expansion reinforces China's strategic positioning. It really carries this sort of potential for increased geopolitical tensions. And it really necessitates a sort of belief that we need to have a much more calibrated approach to diplomatic engagement with China. So, despite these frictions with Western jurisdictions, respondents really do not want to decouple from the West. There's a pragmatic recognition of global interdependence among Chinese citizens. Although Chinese citizens are endorsing ties with Russia, and in fact, deepening ties with Russia, this can be a source of contention between us. And this is something that we do need to note that there is actually a strong support among the Chinese population for deepening ties with Russia. So this is not a blip. This is not a one-year blip. We are seeing this happening over the last 3 years, particularly support for Russia. Um, and so, you know, many respects, cultural diplomacy and people-to-people ties is really a crucial channel for us to engage with China. Ultimately, we want to engineer greater trust with China and vice versa. We want Chinese to trust us, and we want them to trust us as well, and vice versa rather. So we want the Chinese to trust us, and we want to trust them. And so one of the one of the playbooks we've used since the end of World War II has been people-to-people exchanges, cultural diplomacy, soft diplomacy. And this has been on the decline in many Western jurisdictions with China. So what I'm suggesting then is what the data tells us is that we need to continue and perhaps ramp up our cultural diplomacy and ramp up our people-to-people ties with China in order to engineer greater trust with China. Um, and so, although familiarity with some Western jurisdictions does not necessarily translate into trust, they generally do. Except for the United States, as I mentioned, except for Japan, for the most part, we see greater familiarity, greater engagement does engineer greater trust. And shared cultural exchanges can provide that alternative pathways for strengthening international relationships. This can be collaboration in the arts, education, cultural initiatives. These are low-hanging fruit things we can do to engineer greater trust with China and vice versa. So, I mean, I guess as a parting sort of line before we open it up to Q&As is that we do see that both Canada, many Western jurisdictions are have to reconcile this sort of strategic China's strategic sort of expansion. And so we need to reconcile this idea that China is going to engage in areas that we've traditionally entered into. And so we need to ensure there's diplomatic efforts that are measured and inclusive. And again, people-to-people exchange is one of the best ways to create that sort of trust that's necessary. We need to balance economic partnerships with trust building and cultural diplomacy activities. And particularly if you're the Canadian government or if you're Canadians, businesses, this can be a great way for us to shape our long-term engagement with China into the next decade. So let me leave it there. As I said, the website tells you a lot about the raw data for the surveys over the last 3 years. And perhaps we can open up to Q&As at this stage.
Great, Reza. Well, thanks so much for that tour d'horizon. I think there's a lot there a lot of food for thought. And in fact, I encourage everyone to go on our website and have a look at the full document that is now released, because at least for me, as I kind of go through the data slowly, it elicits a lot of additional thinking and areas to speculate about. So I encourage everyone to have a closer look at that. There's a few questions already that are showing up. I encourage a few more. We'll have time to tackle several of them. Perhaps, if I may, Reza, what I'm going to do is I'm going to group together 2 or 3 questions that have to do with some methodological inquiries. So if I may, I'm just going to kind of run through 3 or 4 simple questions here, and you can give people a quick answer as a group. So from Kyle Whitfield was asking, how many people is this survey based on? Jesse Chen was asking, how much can we attribute? No, how true. I'm sorry here. Okay, so here's another methodological question. How much can we attribute these various perceptions to CCP state propaganda? How did they come to these perspectives? Is there any segment of respondents with a broad experience in different countries, and how the results would compare for those people to those who only lived in China? And finally, from Zhen Wang here, I'm curious, how does the survey get citizens' knowledge level about other countries or jurisdictions? Is there a knowledge test for them, or are these self-reported? Right. So I'll start with those 3 kind of methodological questions.
Well, thank you for the 3 methodological questions. Well, this is based on a 2,000 individual sample on average. And it's purposeful sampling. So what we ultimately try to do is try to tap into every single major geography, every major age category, education category, income category, and gender. So those are sort of general sort of things that we tend to do. So it's purposefully sampled that way. There's no weights if there's any academics or any sort of academically inclined individuals, but in terms of methodological approaches, we don't do any weights for the survey. So again, it's purposefully sampled, but it's 2,000. In terms of the question about how do we gauge what their knowledge is? These are all self-reported. Remember, we're looking at the everyday citizen. This is not necessarily an elite population we're looking at. We're looking at what do everyday citizens across China think about the world. And so many this is all self-reported information. Many are telling you what they think about the world effectively. And in terms of the third question, generally speaking, this is a common question we get. Well, how do we know if this is what they think? How do we know this is just not them telling us propaganda and what we want them to think? So it's that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in many respects. There's a few ways we can actually methodologically try and figure out what citizens think. Again, what we can do, first and foremost, is to see how long it takes them to respond. So part of it is a online sort of survey, part of it is telephone, part of it is video as well. And so for the online component, we can actually tell how long it takes them to do keystrokes. So there's keystroke data we can use to try and figure out, are they thinking about the question? And what's the sort of average, or whether, and so that's one way we can do that. In a very small sample, just because of costs, a very, very small sample, we look at their eyes and we figured if you look up, that means you're generally telling the truth. If you're looking down, you're generally lying. So that's another sort of methodological approach we've used. to try and figure out whether or not what they say is accurate. But it also comes back to this idea that there's no reason for the average citizen to not say what they think. There's no consequence for not saying that. This is even beyond the methodological approaches. For the most part, I think it's highly overblown. We tend to believe that party individuals are just going to tote the party line. In various surveys that I've done, I'm even looking at the bad citizen right now, where the bad citizen is doing the opposite of what the party line is. And we're seeing that through the survey data that, they are not towing the party line in many respects here. So there's no reason why citizens would not tell us what they think. There's no consequences for telling us something beyond the party. And even more so, citizens are more and more accustomed to taking surveys. There is a lot of surveys that's done internally within China, and we also have a cross section over the last 3 years, so we can sort of see trend lines that are statistically appropriate. So there's great confidence in these results from that standpoint.
Okay, that's very helpful. So as you were answering that, lots of questions coming in now, which is great. I'll try to bunch them together by thematic as best I can as they come in. But perhaps I'll start with something that's a bit more general, and I guess that actually flows from one of your last observations, Reza, when you're talking about how the survey respondents did see a close alignment between foreign governments' policies and the views of their people, right? So this question is from my former mentor, actually, and former colleague, Ambassador Joseph Caron. So he's asking, what is the influence of popular opinion on the CCP, basically? So I wonder if you can touch on that.
And that's a great question. In fact, we've long known that the party needs popular legitimacy. We tend to believe that's not the case, but in fact, the party requires and needs popular legitimacy to actually engage in many of its policies. And we've known that for years because we know the party has done internal polling in China to see what they can and can't do in many respects. So in many ways, this is sort of an insight into what sort of elasticity the party has in terms of foreign policy. And we do see that that citizens overwhelmingly want China to play a greater role in peacekeeping, to increase its military presence. So in many respects, the party does need this sort of legitimacy, and they've historically needed this legitimacy. This is sort of the core roots of their social compact with the citizenry, is that they are going to reflect the moods of what the citizens want in many respects.
Okay, great. So why don't we move now to a different thematic? So perhaps I'll kick it off with, do we want to talk about Russia or not? No. There's a few people that are coming back at us with some questions about Russia. Maybe we try to put that one to bed very quickly, right? So personally, just for the sake of our audience, right, just gives a few questions, right? And so just to frame them, as you know, but perhaps some of the readers don't. Personally, having spent a lot of time in China, to me, instinctively, there's less than full trust on the part of many Chinese citizens, even the Laobaixing, with respect to Russia. In other words, there are limits to the no limits partnership that are a function of that. There's historical drivers to that. And in fact, on the Russian side, as you probably saw, I think a couple of days ago, there's revelations that, there's active distrust of China on the Russian side. In fact, in their security apparatus, they still refer to China as the enemy, et cetera, right? So I think it's politically convenient to answer that you're favorable towards Russia to some extent. On the other hand, there's broader contextual events that have occurred over the last 2 or 3 years that would lead one to think that the Chinese are probably more trusting of Russia than they were, at least at a superficial level. Immigration data might point to a little bit of a limit to that, in the sense that to the extent people vote with their feet, they'd rather immigrate to many countries in the West that have lower trust ratings vis-a-vis Russia. I look to that as kind of a key indicator, if you will. But at the same time, perhaps the fact that Russia is clearly kind of morphing into the junior partner within the China-Russia relationship might actually make it easier for people to trust them as well, just given that higher level of comfort. So I'm actually incorporating a couple of questions from the chat here into that broader context. And if I might just add one more and then turn it to you, please bear with me for a moment. There's lots of questions coming in here. It's a question from Barry Mayer. How do we separate China public ideas from us being, that's not a Russia question. No, so that's anonymous, right? Given, here it is, it's interesting spin on things. Given the US's budding alliance with Russia and their increasing alignment on social conservatism, nationalism, and authoritarianism with Russia and other dictatorships, does this pave the way for a more or less favorable perception of the US and China? So there's the broader contextual elements, a couple points I tried to incorporate, and then that last question, if you can tackle those, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, thank you all for those questions. As I mentioned beforehand, over the last 3 years, we've thought a bit about why Russia plays such a prominent role. I gave you the top line reason, market access and so forth. But I think if you dig deeper, there are some fault lines here in terms of why certain demographics really see Russia with great affinity. First and foremost, here is micro generations who have greater affinity towards Russia than other micro generations. So let's talk about the Xi generation. And the Xi generation are those who are, say, 18 to about 26, 27. Those are the ones who grew up in their formative years. They're still young individuals, mind you, but they grew up among the sort of Xi Jinping era. For the most part, that generation is the one, or that micro generation is the one that's has greater affinity towards Russia. And part of it has to do with the fact that Russia is seen as championing an alternative order, that Russia is seen as an actor that is standing up to the West. And it's seen as, it kind of plays into the sort of quasi-nationalism or a quasi sort of different order that challenges the dominant Western order. And so Russia is that sort of symbol. So we see among that micro generation a great affinity towards Russia. And again, this is reinforced not only through the survey data that we have, but it's reinforced through media data for that particular micro generation. Among the older cohorts, we see a mixed message. We see that there's a championing of the fact that, well, hey, China now has a much more advantageous position over Russia. And this is great for China. And so in many respects, they trust Russia because it's an actor that's known more so than other actors. But even more so, it's this idea that, well, China has the upper hand. So we see that among the sort of older generation, and this reinforces the sort of affinity towards Russia. Now, again, I think it's really crucial to reinforce this idea that how individuals see the world now. It doesn't matter if you're in China or in Canada or anywhere in the world. It's often a reflection of things that's been accumulating over the last few years. And so it'd be really fascinating for us to observe as this future iterations of the survey continues, how Russia might be perceived in lesser eyes over these micro generations. What I would submit to you is that for the general population, Russia is not going to be seen as in such great eyes as it has. And we're starting to see seeds of that already. I mean, last year and the year before, we're seeing trust in Russia has decreased slightly, and among other indicators as well. Particularly among this young Xi generation, I think they're not the ones generally driving policy. They're generally not the ones who are driving party thinking, but they are going to be much more influential because many of them are becoming despondent to the party in many respects. I kind of mentioned the bad citizen, right? These bad citizens, those who are not taking cues from the party, are generally from the Xi generation, ironically. They're part of the lying flat movement. They're part of those who are not getting the good jobs. They're part of those who are not, getting a good material life, so to speak. And so I think for that generation, that micro generation, it's a fad to see Russia with such great eyes. But I think as they grow up a bit more, they might have greater disaffinity towards Russia. Now, the question about the United States is interesting. I think it might be overblown. I know that the United States is going towards dictators and going towards authoritarian regimes. I think for the most part, America has been quite consistent. If we take a much more long-term view, that authoritarian regimes are in contradiction to U.S. values and norms. So I think we're just living in a blip right now. But for the most part, I wouldn't read too much into it. What I could say is that there are more authoritarian regimes now in the world than democratic regimes. And so for us to say that the United States is um, might play might cozying up more to authoritarian regimes, well, there's a numerical issue here. We have many of the large nations, many of the rising nations, many of our BRICS are semi-authoritarian or even a full-blown authoritarian. So we do need to engage with them. And so I wouldn't dig too deep into that sort of query there.
Okay, well, thanks. That's very helpful to kind of expand a bit on the Russia question. I really appreciate it. And I know you just spent a few months in Los Angeles, so I'll take your word on the optimism with respect to the future U.S. I'll put it in the bank, which I'm very keen to do that. I think I'm going to move to a couple of other thematics to try to align with some of your presentation. Before that, just one quick question, Greg Goldhawk. I think a lot of people would like to know. So who chooses the individual Chinese citizens that you interview?
It's completely randomized. This is a randomized sort of survey. And so it's three different methodologies. For the telephone, it's random digit dialing. For online, it's IP addresses can be duplicated. So it's very randomized in that respect. And for the video one, it's just completely random in terms of who we selected in terms of those individuals. Random insofar that we're looking at certain key indicators in terms of our demographics. So it's against purposeful sampling. We want to have certain age, certain gender, certain locations. But beyond that is a randomization of this sample.
Okay, great. I'm going to move to China's perception of itself in the world. Your results seem to indicate some tension between perceived role or desired role of China in terms of being a force for peace, be involved in kind of globally constructive activities, and yet at the same time an uptick in the support for military intervention, right? So it seems like there's like the kind of views about soft power and hard power that are both kind of going in a similar direction, almost contradictory in a way with respect to what that entails, right? Is it possible to unpack that a little bit?
Right.
Maybe touch as well at the same time, Reza, on I guess what I would call, for lack of a better term, the lack of proselytizing instinct that also accompanies the Chinese view of foreign policy. So there's not this desire to kind of like export the Chinese values or to a large extent the Chinese governance model. So if that's the case, what beyond this tension between the soft and hard power, what would be the reasons that would drive hard power activity globally, given that lack of proselytizing instinct, for lack of a better term? Yeah.
So there's a few sort of analytical clarities here. First and foremost, although they're not overtly trying to export their model, by virtue of engaging with China, you are going to, take their model in many respects. You are going to infuse their values and their norms. Any form of engagement with China is going to have that. We often think so if Canada engages with China, we often think we're influencing them. Or if the United States engage with China or the EU, we often think we're influencing them. But there's a bidirectional influence going on. And so even though China is not overtly exporting its model, ultimately it will be exporting its model by virtue of engagement. The more intimate engagement that it has, the more you're going to see that model being infused into that whole society. And so although it's not overt, it is going to occur. So I think that's perhaps the heart of the the contention there is that they are not overtly trying to do so, but they will. Now, I also don't think there's a contradiction between hard and soft power sort of tactics. You do need to increase your military presence if you want to have greater national security. And if you have greater military presence or greater military hardware, you can utilize that towards peacekeeping missions. They're essentially getting the playbook from the United States over since World War II. So they're increasing hard and soft power at the same time. Um, where they're having challenges is in the soft power domain, mind you. Um, the sort of what I'm trying to suggest to policymakers is that we need to improve our soft power in China rather than take it back, rather than reduce our soft power, because that's the way you engineer trust. The Chinese are trying to engage in greater soft power activities, but many jurisdictions are resistant to that. So we do need to find this sort of medium in which both entities can, both China and Western jurisdictions can engage in soft power exchanges. But I can't stress this enough. By virtue of engaging with China, we are going to be influenced by China if we are the actor that's less powerful. And that's something that we don't think too much about.
Okay, great. Maybe as a quick follow-up, I'll paraphrase a question by Devan Prithipal here. Do you think that the Global South is in play, and which way is it going to lean, and how interested is China in taking a predominant role in that sphere?
Well, thank you for that question, Devin, and I hope you're doing well. It's interesting because China has its tentacles in the Global South. And it has and it's infusing it through its supply chains, and infusing it through development activities. As the United States withdraws from international development, as it withdraws from a lot of cooperation with the Global South in many respects, this creates a room for China to play a greater role. So although the survey doesn't capture that too much, because we don't really speak to the Global South in the survey that much, I think the overall tones would be that there's greater support among the Chinese public for China to go into the Global South even more so. Let me put it to you in a different way. The everyday Chinese citizen wants to engage further with the West. They want to have greater economic cooperation with the West, more technological cooperation with the West, more environmental cooperation, along all the lists of things that we query. For the most part, citizens want to engage in cooperation. There's no idea of de-risking or the like. And so this holds true as well for the Global South. There's this idea that it's a pragmatic approach. It's in the interest of China to engage with everyone. Whether or not they trust everyone the same is another story, but they do want to engage.
Okay. That's great. I do want to make sure we have some time to talk about Canada, China. But before I move to that, there's a few questions now showing up again with respect to social media. I think it's kind of an interesting topic. So I'm going to put two questions to you here. One is from Jesse Chen. How true is the assumption or idea that the CCP has less control in the social media setting than other settings? Social media is an obviously significant tool for influencing public opinion. How can you know their level of influence? So that's the first question on social media. And then the second one from Wei Su Yu, who's just getting ready to join our team, actually. PhD from U of A in finance. Do you think the reason Chinese people rely more on social media than state media is not necessarily because the government controls state media more easily, but simply because people today tend to use social media more and watch less TV in general? So that's, again, I think it's interesting because to some extent, the social media environment in China is just as multifaceted and exciting as anything you would find in the West. But of course, there's an undercurrent of supervision and control there, right? So unpacking that is something that we're all trying to get a sense of. So if you can share anything, that'd be great.
Sure. So great questions. So in terms of social media, I think the first statement to be made is there is control over social media. Let's be clear about that. But we're talking about relative control and relative approaches in terms of if the state provides a directive to television, to radio, to traditional media, usually the editor of the TV, the newspaper, or the radio program is giving directives on a daily, weekly, monthly basis about what things should be stressed, what things should not be stressed. So there's a direct link between what the state wants to emphasize and towards traditional media. So if your sources of information of the world about the world is only coming from traditional media, there's a direct correlation or relationship between state sort of worldview and the average citizen's consumption of that worldview. With social media, there is control. In fact, there's probably more tacit control rather than overt control, insofar that um, the state can always censor, the state can always shut down, the state can always bully, and there's numerous documented cases of this. Um, but the state has a harder time directing messaging towards the population. And so that's what I wanted to highlight, that it's a harder sort of relationship between state messaging and the consumers of that message, i.e. the average citizen through social media relative to traditional media. And that has implications. First implication is it suggests that the party is going to have has become much more sophisticated in providing its messaging through social media, and it has a harder time influencing the everyday citizen's perception through social media. The other sort of implication is as well, if you're in the West and you're trying to improve the public image of Canada, for example, social media is an approach that you might want to take where we can actually influence, where we can actually get the greater messaging about the wonderful nation of Canada through this particular medium. And in fact, you're right. The majority of individuals are actually looking at social media, so it is driven by that function, akin to most jurisdictions around the world.
Okay. Interesting question here that just arrived. So before we go to Canada, China, do you have any insights on the awareness and perception of Chinese citizens of Chinese overseas operations in the West, whether that is influence on diaspora to further national interest or encouraging academic returnees, etc.? So how aware is do you have a sense of how aware the Chinese population is of those kind of overseas operations from the government? Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're looking at mainland citizens, so we're not looking at the overseas diaspora. The only sort of potential glimpse into that is that we do have a question where we ask citizens if they have any foreign exposure. In other words, do they get any education overseas? Do they travel overseas? And that was in previous iterations of the survey. There wasn't a major impact.
But are you able to glean anything in terms of how aware Chinese domestic citizens might be of their government's international activities?
Unfortunately, no, not through the data that we have.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to move to Canada China issues. If you will, I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack here. I'm going to come at it from a tangential angle, but I think it'll lead to an opportunity to discuss some of what you presented today, Reza. So I want to start by talking a little bit about Canadians' perceptions of China. And I think you've actually done some work on that as well that's soon to be released. I got a sneak peek of it without revealing too much. I think it aligns with some of what I've seen elsewhere as well. So if it's okay, I'll share a couple of the quick hits there, and that'll allow us to segue into the results of the survey here, right? So, I think it's no surprise. Generally Canadians right now have a relatively low level of trust vis-a-vis China. It's much lower than the Chinese citizens' level of trust towards Canada, even if that's in the relative decline as well. But at the same time, Canadians have a high appreciation of the importance of China on the global stage, and how that can impact Canadian interests. There's also a lot more skepticism with respect to engaging with China in areas such as trade or investment than there would be, let's say, to work with China on peacekeeping or global issues such as climate. So I guess that's what I see, some overlap there, right? So if you look at how China sees the world survey, clearly the most openness from the perception of Chinese population is to work with Canada on areas such as peacekeeping and global challenges such as climate. And that's also the area where the Canadian people seem to be most willing to engage as well. So does that create some space here that we need to really take a closer look at? And if so, off the top of your head, are there some specific areas beyond climate and peacekeeping that you think we should be thinking about?
So great questions. What's really startling is that if I was to, I did run this survey where we're looking at how Canadians perceive China. And if I was to, if I'm doing that presentation, in many respects, there's so many similarities insofar that we don't trust China and China doesn't trust us. And it begs the question, well, that's why we don't actually have these fruitful engagements. There's not that minimum baseline of trust amongst both societies. And so both sides in an ideal world would try to improve that relationship by improving knowledge. At the heart of it, it's not necessarily only trust. At the heart of it is that we know very little about each other. And that's surprising. I mean, let me repeat that. We know so little about China, and the Chinese know so little about us in a meaningful way. And that's the heart of the reason why we don't trust each other. So, I mean, at the most basic level, I think we need to do a better job of promoting Canada in China, and vice versa. China needs to do a better job in promoting China in Canada. Now, here's the crux of the issue at hand, though. I don't think the Chinese have a major interest in promoting themselves in Canada. They have other bigger fishes to fry, shall we say. Um, and we see this with the data from how China sees the world, that Canada and Australia and India are the three seen as not significant to China's long-term future. Whereas if we were to do that in the Canadian context, we would see China is actually a major actor for us in our worldview, that the United States, China, EU partners perhaps, are seen with greater affinity than how the Chinese see us. So I think that plays a major role in terms of why there's a lack of trust, because we don't know each other. And moreover, there's not a willingness to learn about each other on one side versus the other. So I think at the most baseline level, that's at the core. In terms of issues, the environment's the easiest, it's low-hanging fruit. Um, we definitely, I mean, you got to remember in the domestic context in China, there's greater leeway to discuss the environment because it's something that affects all citizens. It's seen as a local issue as well as a national one, but it's seen as a less risky sort of proposition to engage with as an issue area. So that's why we see civil society actors engage in environmental issues. We see the local governments engage with that. Well, while we see more civic action in China in terms of the environment. So it's a safer space to engage with. So conversely, for the Canadians, we should go into those safer spaces just to engage with China. And then once we are into those safer spaces, we can twin those safe spaces with, shall we say, more contentious issues. What I mean by that is this: the environment can be a gateway to certain other issues that we might have greater contentions with China with. It can be a gateway for us to twin by, say, maybe we have a problematic trade relationship in X area. We can twin that with an environmental issue where we can resolve both. And I think that's a prudent strategy there. There are not a lot of safe spaces in China for Canada to operate with, but I would suggest that the environment is perhaps one of the safest spaces. Rights is not. There's a different understanding of rights. And it just means there's a different order of importance of what rights are seen as more important in China than, say, for Canadians and vice versa. So that's not necessarily a safe space, but we can use the environment as a way in which we can talk about rights, so to speak. I just finished a paper looking at environment and ethnic minorities. In ethnic minorities, their realities is considered a contentious issue. The environment, a safe space. You can twin both. So I think that's a strategy. If I was Canadian, the Canadian government or Canadian actors, that's a strategy I would want to employ.
Perhaps at the broader level, a metaphor that you may agree with would be the stronger the bridge, the heavier the freight you can carry, right? And so part of the engagement is not necessarily, strategy is not necessarily one of engagement for engagement's sake, but rather it's a tactical move, so that the more fabric you have, then the more traction you have and ability you have to address some of the more difficult aspects of a relationship, right?
Exactly.
Okay, actually. On that question and on what you just answered, interestingly, maybe a little silver lining is when I look at the data in the How China Sees the World survey, and I think it's reflected in your soon to come out survey on Canadian perceptions. The younger the cohort, the more trust there is, and the more willingness to engage on both sides, right? So, if you allow me to extrapolate that there's or to to use what you were suggesting, that there's a correlation sometimes between being better informed and having more trust, or more understanding, then maybe there's a silver lining there going forward that we can cling to. Okay, so to continue on that theme, and also again to try to use Canadian sentiment as a window, and here we're going to move beyond the work you're going to be talking about, but clearly we've all seen recent surveys in the news where there's a little bit of a softening. It's not a very soft attitude, but there's a softening of Canadians' attitudes towards China that has occurred in the last few months. Is that because in the minds of many Canadians, China has become less bad, or is it a reaction to their perception that the U.S. has become more bad, right? And so how punctual is this trend? Do you think it's a sustained trend, or do you think that this willingness to give China a second look on the part of many Canadians who were disinclined to do so until recently, that trend could reverse if, for example, U.S. behavior modulates, or there's a conclusion of, I don't know, a Canada-U.S. economic and security pact that kind of puts the halcyon days of Trumpian uncertainty behind us, and resets the relationship on a new foot. I mean, so do you see this as an enduring trend, or something that's more contextually driven? Mm-hmm.
So it's certainly contextually driven. With that being said, we can take this opportunity to use it to our advantage. We've long talked about an Indo-Pacific strategy, and ultimately at the heart of the Indo-Pacific strategy is de-risking, is about having greater market opportunities in the Indo-Pacific, that steers away from our traditional partners in many respects. De-risking from China, de-risking from the United States. And so we can use this opportunity as a way. I mean, if there's overwhelming sort of support among the Canadian public to engage with China a bit more, to engage with the Indo-Pacific more generally more, and less so the United States, given the realities with the US and China and Canada right now, I think we should take that opportunity. Part of it is always timing. This is something that we always talk about. It's the timing and the timing with the public support for certain actions. And I think at this stage, we should engage greater with China a bit more so, but also with our Indo-Pacific partners as well. And I mean, the Canadian government has been suggesting they're going to do that for years, and they are doing that for years, but this is a way for us to accelerate it. It gives us an opportunity to accelerate these opportunities. We're having greater partnerships with China and Indo-Pacific partners as well.
Okay, great. Maybe we're kind of moving towards the end game here of our webinar, and I think we've managed to cover many questions. I think again, I'll paraphrase a couple of the questions here and try to put a little bit of a spin on it. Until recently, I think some folks conveniently would kind of like summarize the U.S.-China relationship as basically a function of the 3 T's, basically tech, Taiwan, and tariffs, right? I mean, it's a bit reductionistic, but it does cover a lot of the bases in terms of what's the focus of, for example, the talks going on right now in London, or the ones that just concluded. Taiwan's a very important issue, but I'll put that to the side for the moment. Tariffs, with the exception of some issues we need to iron out vis-a-vis EVs or canola or some what have you. That's not the same kind of driver of our relationship as with the US right now. But tech is, right? It's something that Canada is also very interested in. So China is really, not in all areas, but in many areas now, China is the tech leader, undisputedly. And you could argue at some level that there could be some complementarity between Canadian and Chinese capabilities in that sphere. But at the same time, all this bleeds over into issues of national security, of intellectual property, and also mutual understanding and trust, right? And so I wonder, as to go back to that metaphor of needing to engage on many dimensions in order to have a more kind of like fulsome and effective relationship. Do you see any space for informed and productive engagement with China in the tech space for Canada? And if so, could you kind of like elaborate on that a bit?
That's a complicated question. We get rid of the security elements. Um, if we remove that element, I think there is space for research, shared research. There's space for Canadian companies to engage with China and vice versa. But at the end of the day, I think we'll be a small player, a small actor in the Chinese eyes. And I think that's what the data is telling us. China does not see us as a major player for them
Okay.
in the tech space or in economic relations. So there's a, by virtue of that, that means there's a misalignment in terms of equal partnerships. I think this only works, particularly with the security apparatus in the background. It only works if there's a mutual appreciation of each other. I don't think there will be at this stage. At this stage, we need more trust building activities. We need to showcase Canadian sort of skills a bit more. And I'm always reminded by this. Before I was an academic, I was briefly I was briefly in Canberra, in Australia, with the High Commission there, where I was looking with the public affairs sort of model. And one of the things that I read was trying to figure out what is Australia's perception of Canada um, at the time. And Australians thought we were exactly like them, except we were not technologically advanced. And it was befuddling. It's like, how can they not think we're not technologically advanced? And I think in many respects, I always think back about that. I don't think the Chinese see us as technological, as having technology that we can provide added sort of weight to or added elements to their relationship. And I think that partially, I mean, at least for the general public, we're talking about the general public here, they do not see us as a partner in which we can have added value relative to other Western partners, shall we say. As I said, Australia, India, and Canada are seen as the bottom in terms of importance.
Well,
So I think,
that's a very I think that's a very useful insight, Reza, because maybe for our policymakers, it's an opportunity to kind of I know that our government is always trying to rebrand Canada in the most effective way
mhm,
possible,
mhm,
but from a public diplomacy perspective, finding better ways to underscore how we actually are a tech leader in many
mhm,
areas. In fact, the
mhm,
comparison with Australia is, I think, quite enlightening. I mean, we're a resource power just like Australia is in terms of rocks
mhm,
and trees, etc. Energy, but we're also, we manufacture advanced aircraft. We're a quantum leader.
mhm,
We're very
mhm,
advanced in fields where Australia is not a player, right? And so there's a much more
mhm,
textured economy in Canada
mhm,
that should perhaps allow us to rise beyond what you're presenting as a very what we should find a very humbling perception of Canada
mhm,
in the minds of the Chinese.
mhm,
Maybe in closing, if we haven't been able to raise awareness in the minds of the Chinese population with respect to our technological capabilities, what about our opportunity to make Chinese citizens and policymakers more aware of how much of an important player we could be on the resource side? So, in other words, with Trans Mountain Pipeline now being online,
mhm, mhm,
with a new government in place that seems to be genuinely committed to trying to turn Canada into an energy superpower. Again, going back to that bridge metaphor, would you
mhm.
agree that if we were to up our game as a resource exporter to China, that could also give us a little bit more profile relevance and might even trickle into changes in data in future iterations of the survey? Yeah.
Certainly, I think it, I mean, it does give us a sort of a foot into the sort of bridge, shall we say, for the Chinese public to see us in different eyes. But we have to use that footing in many respects to highlight our technological advancements, to highlight our other areas of strengths that perhaps the general public is not aware of. And again, this is where social media plays a role. I think, particularly if you want to target the general public, we need to have a greater branding of Canada in China, and we have to continuously rebrand Canada as a technological leader, which we are. But it doesn't seem like the Chinese seem to know it as en masse, according to the data that we have.
Okay, so there's a bit of a to-do list here that's flowing from our analysis of the survey. In closing, I will say I am heartened by the fact that there is goodwill on both sides, and there's
Mhm,
certainly in the aggregate, a lot of willingness on the part of Chinese people to engage with Canada. I think if you rank Canada vis-a-vis other countries, it certainly gives a sense of the relative importance in people's eyes of where Canada lies. But I would argue that at the same time, in the abstract, the Canada brand remains very strong, and that generally speaking, Chinese people have a very positive view of Canada and a willingness to work with us. So I'm aware that during our conversation, both of us are actually not really pointing in a concrete manner towards perhaps areas that have to do with global governance and global issues, where Canada and China could perhaps work a bit more closely together in a manner that would be accretive to the global commons, right? And so I think that's another kind of thing that I'm going to put on my to-do list, which is kind of do some serious thinking about how can we take advantage of that mutual willingness to work together to maybe identify some areas that actually are accretive, not just to Canada, China, but also to the globe. So maybe you can help me do that, and we can kind of come up with some thinking we can share with everyone in the future. But I might wrap it up here. We're getting close to end. I certainly wanted to make sure to thank the team at the China Institute that has made this possible. Some great editing, some great designing, and logistical support, not only in terms of getting the report ready, but also even in terms of getting this webinar to function properly. And of course, thank you, Reza, for your vision and commitment to trying to elucidate some of these key drivers of Canada-China relations through what is actually not an easy thing to do, which is doing some survey work in China. So I hope that we have whetted everyone's appetite, and certainly at the Institute, we look forward to some feedback and any constructive ideas that may come from the audience in terms of how to best apply the results of this survey going forward. So thank you again, Reza. And
thank you.
And to everyone else, thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for our next event. Have a great day.